I can still remember the tenderness of my little brother's arm as I bit down into it during a fight that we had when I was 12. The softness of his flesh against my teeth and the metallic taste of his blood on my tongue was euphoric. And it was in that moment that my life changed forever. The psychologists called it Wendigo psychosis, but the actual term was pathological cannibalism. I can never forget the horrified look on my mother's face as Brenda, my childhood psychologist, told her that I was struggling with pathological cannibalism, which is an extremely rare but real issue that sometimes occurs due to underlying psychiatric disorders or problems. Even though I was so young, I could tell everyone around me thought I was a monster. And what made things even worse was that none of the many psychologists that my mother dragged me to knew how to handle my issue. Because cases involving pathological cannibalistic impulses were extraordinarily rare, and there was little to no knowledge about my condition. My mother often told me that I wasn't always like this, but she could see the signs, as my strange behavior all started when I was 7. During that age, I started showing signs of extreme allotriophagy. It's a disorder where a person repeatedly eats or consumes things that aren't normally considered food. I would consume everything from my hair to my fingernails, and I would struggle with my mother when she quickly took these things out of my mouth before I could swallow. I would also throw tantrums whenever she tried to stop me. And things only got worse from there. When I was 10, I developed another condition called dermatophagia. That's a condition where a person compulsively bites through their own skin, drawing blood. I would leave deep bite marks on my arms, hands, and fingers, and there were cases where my mother had to rush me to the hospital to stop the bleeding. After an examination, the psychologist told my parents that I developed a disturbing, body-focused, repetitive behavior. They made several attempts to fix my peculiar case of BFRB with self-biting behavior, as they tried everything they could to stop me from doing it. In the end, all of their efforts failed. And it wasn't long before my disorders eventually turned into full-blown autophagia, which is the morbid act of consuming one's own flesh. The new condition was basically an extreme form of dermatophagia, as rather than simply biting down on my own skin, I began to tear out and eat my own flesh. A little while after I turned 12, my mother found me bleeding on the floor with a huge patch of flesh missing from my leg. I disassociated due to my psychiatric illnesses, and I cut off parts of my own skin using a sharp knife. I can still remember the disgust on my mother's face when she found me sitting there with a mouthful of my own flesh. Later that same month, my older brother, Kevin, tried to stop me from hurting myself again so I wouldn't eat my flesh or bite myself, and I didn't let him. So we got into a huge fight, and I bit him. It was at that moment that I got a sick epiphany, as I realized that it would be much better to eat other people to satiate this never-ending hunger for human flesh. It really was a sick revelation. But even at that young age, I knew it was much better than eating my own flesh. And it was at this point that my childhood psychologist, Brenda, diagnosed me with pathological cannibalism that I mentioned earlier. She told my parents that all of the disorders that I had developed throughout my early childhood were leading up to this, and she assured my parents that she'd help me overcome the pathology, which she often referred to as Wendigo psychosis. But even after hours of examinations and therapy sessions, she or any of the following psychologists were never able to help me. It's hard to put this feeling into words, and even harder to write it down, but I've always felt like there was something sinister living inside me. A monster that was always whispering in my ear and urging me to sink my teeth into my own flesh just so I could taste my skin and the metallic flavor of blood that would soon follow. I always tried my best to fight back, but these feelings were overwhelming, even when I was a child. However, after I viciously bit my brother's arm, the voice changed the words it used to whisper, as it was now telling me to eat and consume everyone around me. I often suffered through identity shifts and memory gaps, during which I would commit even more atrocious cannibalistic acts. When I was much older, my psychologist told me that the comorbid cluster of psychiatric disorders I'd been suffering from due to my neurological abnormalities had gotten worse with age. They said my cannibalistic urges had become paraphilic, which could unfortunately lead to even more frequent psychosis-driven behavioral escalation, and they urged me to take some medication to subdue my severe paraphilic disorders. I was given several high-dose antipsychotics like olanzapine, risperidone, and haloperidol to treat the underlying psychosis. I was then told that these drugs would help fix and subdue most of the paraphilic disorders and psychiatric illnesses, but no matter how many pills I took, my compulsive urges never fully went away. I secretly lived with these urges, carrying them around like they were a badge of shame. I eventually fell into a deep depression, and I reached a new low point in my life. But it was around this time that my mother had a long, deep talk with me about my issues, and she told me that I was stronger than my disorders, so I shouldn't let these urges control my life. And from that moment on, I made a conscious decision to genuinely change my life. I went to college for 4 years, and I got a good paying job. I even started dating, and I eventually married my beautiful wife, Claire, who gave birth to a son that we named Philip. It took me several years of struggle to get my life to that point, and even though I felt like I'd achieved what I'd set out to do, the voice of that monster was still there. I eventually stopped taking my antipsychotics out of anger because I assumed they weren't working anymore, because I could still occasionally hear the voice telling me to rip the flesh from my new family. I felt like I didn't need them anymore, because I told myself that the love for my family would help me overcome any urges I may have. But I was wrong, and the voices just got louder. I knew it was only a matter of time before my disorders got out of hand again, and I didn't want to dissociate and hurt my family, because I knew I'd never forgive myself. So I started looking for an outlet, and it wasn't long before I came across the infamous Cannibal Cafe forum on the dark web. I'd heard about it before, but I didn't think it was real. I'd also seen some people online saying that the original site, which used to be on the internet during the late 90s, had been taken down, so I assumed there was no other way to access it. However, one night, when the voices had become unbearable as they were constantly urging me to carry out these sadistic acts, I downloaded the Tor browser to access the dark web, and I eventually came across a dark web forum called Cannibal Cafe. At first I was confused because I knew the original Cannibal Cafe website on the ClearNet had been shut down in the early 2000s. However, I later found out from members of the exclusive forum that even though both forums shared the same name, this particular dark web forum was inspired by and modeled after the original Cannibal Cafe. This dark web forum felt like my salvation, because it allowed me to talk about things my psychologist didn't understand, and I got to do that with other like-minded people on the forum. I logged on, and I talked to other members of the forum every night after my wife had gone to bed. There was a small part of me that knew I was doing something wrong, but every minute I spent on that forum made me feel like I had finally found a place where I belonged. It really seemed like I was a recovering alcoholic who had just walked into a wine tasting event. But in this case, the alcoholism was cannibalism, and the wine tasters were connoisseurs of human flesh who constantly validated my desires by telling me I wasn't wrong for feeling this way. All of the anonymous people on the Cannibal Cafe forum became an avenue for me to vent and to channel my urges. And I could feel the voices growing much louder now, but I was fine with it because I came across an anonymous individual whose username was myvesdisciple783, and he told me that I should be embracing the monster that I believed was inside of me. I met myvesdisciple783 about a month after I started visiting the Cannibal Cafe forum, and we grew to be very close. We were both huge fans of the Rotenberg cannibal. That's a German man named Armin Maives who consumed parts of another man named bernd-juergen. Maives was a cannibal just like us, and in the year 2001, he posted an ad on the internet looking for a willing participant who would allow him to consume their body and fulfill his cannibalistic desires. Bernd-juergen saw the ad and he agreed to it. After meeting Maives, both men severed Bernd's genitalia and ate it. Unfortunately, Bernd later died, but Armin Maives did not let his corpse go to waste, as he consumed parts of the body before he was unjustly thrown in prison. Maives disciple 783 and I had a lengthy conversation about how unjust the incarceration of Armin Maives was, and we even spoke about pooling some money together so that we can buy the alleged tape of Maives eating Bernd's corpse that's supposedly out there on the dark web. After we bonded over our shared love for Armin Maives, I began to text Maives disciple 783 for hours on end. We eventually made our own private dark web forum called Cannibals Anonymous, where we would talk about our desires, and he told me that I shouldn't try to silence the voice in my head with those high-dose antipsychotics that psychologists had told me to start taking again. He then told me to accept the words the little voice in my head kept whispering, because there was nothing wrong with eating one another if it was consensual. The more we talked, the more I believed that the anonymous man behind Maives disciple 783 was the only person in the world who truly understood me. We spent most of our free time texting back and forth during the months that followed, and one Saturday, Maives disciple 783 sent me a message that would once again alter the course of my life moving forward. He suggested that we both fulfill our desires like Maives and Brandis, and that we should set a date and a location where we could consensually eat parts of each other's flesh. I was ecstatic, because I'd never had a willing individual offer me parts of their flesh to consume. And I remember telling myself that there was nothing wrong with it. It was consensual. After texting back and forth on our private dark web forum for some time, I quickly took out a huge chunk of our savings account to buy a remote cabin that we could use to carry out our plans. I also lied to my wife. I told her that I had a business trip that weekend and I was counting down the days until it happened. However, when the weekend came, I got an unfortunate text from Maives disciple 783 telling me that he had second thoughts and that he wanted to back out. Words can't explain the rage that I felt in that moment. and I became even more infuriated when I tried to convince him, and then he stopped answering my texts. I'd stopped going to my psychologist at this point, and I threw away all of the antipsychotics that I'd been taking, so my mind couldn't handle the rejection. I remember letting out this guttural scream from the top of my lungs, and then suddenly everything around me went dark. When I came back to my senses, I watched in horror as my wife, Claire, was cowering in front of me while holding our son, Philip. Philip was fine, but my wife was screaming at the top of her lungs, and she had, well, you can imagine. I didn't need anyone to tell me the atrocities that I'd just committed, as I could see nasty bite marks all over Claire's body, and I could still taste the metallic flavor of her blood on my tongue. I couldn't believe that I'd tried to eat and consume my own wife, and I collapsed, screaming, because I remembered that horrified look on people's faces when I used to disassociate as a kid. No one had looked at me that way since my mother found me eating my own flesh when I was 12, but it was the same expression that my wife had on her face as she began to put distance between me and them. I will never be able to express the magnitude of guilt that I felt in the hours that followed. My wife, who was still looking at me like I was a monster, had to fight me off to stop me from doing any more damage. I knew that was the end of our family, but Claire loved me too much to call the cops, and even if she hated me in that moment, she still knew I was the man who had loved her for all of those years, and she didn't want her son's father to spend the rest of his life in prison. So, she decided to check me into a mental institution, saying I was a danger to myself and to others. I didn't protest at all. I knew I deserved much worse for what I'd done. It's been about 3 years now that I've been in this institution. My wife has stopped coming to see me, and honestly, I don't blame her. I don't even know what day it is, but I'm currently sitting in my room, writing all of this down as a form of journaling. I often wonder if death would finally satiate the seemingly insatiable morbid hunger of the monster that still lives inside of me. It's taken me some time, but I've come to the realization that it's only when I leave this world that the voice nagging me in my head will stop, and I truly hope when that day comes, I'll finally understand what it means to have some peace and quiet. In the year 2004, a truly morbid true crime case that is mostly unknown to the public occurred in the small town of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. It was an extremely niche case, and most of the details were redacted, but according to a few statements from the locals, it was later revealed that an anonymous man was institutionalized at the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center after he had attempted to attack his family. Official reports were sparse, as the case was never reported to local authorities. However, a few anonymous neighbors who gave secondhand accounts claimed that the institutionalized man had attempted to cannibalize and eat his own wife the night before. His wife, whose name was also redacted, chose to give no official statements. Locals believed that she wanted to protect her husband, whose attempted filicide would have landed him at least 20 years in prison on an attempted murder charge, so she denied everything. The widely unknown case was seen as a rumor during the weeks that followed the initial reports, but records show that the disturbing details of the case actually did happen, as the anonymous man apparently suffered from a psychotic and dissociative episode, which led his wife to admit him to the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center. While it was never confirmed, sources close to the unnamed family said that even though he'd committed an atrocious act that nearly killed his wife, she didn't want the father of her child to spend the rest of his life in prison. It's unclear what happened after the anonymous man was checked into the Fergus Falls Regional Treatment Center. Several records show that the center was closed in 2007, and both his and his family's current whereabouts are unknown. It's also difficult to trace the exclusive dark web Cannibal Cafe forum that the anonymous referenced in 2004. Several records confirm that the original Cannibal Cafe never existed on the dark web, as it was strictly a ClearNet website created in 1994 by an individual using the alias Pero Loco. While I was unable to confirm the exact origins of the dark web forum mentioned in this case, it's believed to have been one of several successor sites that emerged after the original Cannibal Cafe was shut down in 2002. The gruesome case of attempted cannibalism sparked similar discourse to the more famous Armin Meiwes case during the months that followed the incident. There were apparently a few people who argued whether an individual should be jailed or placed in an asylum for carrying out a consensual act of cannibalism. However, regardless of differing opinions, the law remains crystal clear. Several law enforcement agents who weighed in with their opinions on the case stated that it doesn't matter whether both parties consent to ghoulish acts like cannibalism or murder, because at the end of the day, these acts are illegal, and any individual carrying them out will be punished by the full force of the law. On the 17th of October, 2019, I met an anonymous man on the infamous dark web forum called Dread. For those who don't know the platform, Dread is often referred to as Reddit's evil twin, a place where dark web users can talk freely. The Anon's username was White Noise, and my life was never the same after I came into contact with this individual. While I didn't know it at the time, visiting the dark side of the internet to acquire the services of White Noise led me to lose everything I'd ever loved. There hasn't been a day that's passed where I don't regret my actions, and I know I'll carry this guilt for the rest of my life. It all began after my 42nd birthday. I'd been going through a midlife crisis for a few months, and I was in a really bad place. I'd recently lost my job after my company abruptly decided to cut costs by letting people go. My marriage was also on the rocks. I was constantly fighting with my wife, Laura, and my son, Simon, had stopped talking to me altogether. I knew he blamed me for the problems that I was having with his mom, which only made things worse between us. It truly felt like I'd hit rock bottom. I was desperate to take the edge off, searching for something, anything, that would make me feel alive again. It wasn't long before my mind wandered back to old, bad habits, and I began to seriously entertain the idea of using hard substances again. I knew it was a bad decision. I was an unemployed man in his 40s, isolated from his family, and very clearly unraveling. My better judgment screamed at me not to do it, but at the time, using substances again felt like the only thing that might pull me out of the slump that I was in. I'd been down that road before, back when I was in college. During finals, I'd experimented with specific hard substances after convincing myself that it would help me push through when coffee and prescription stimulants like Adderall no longer felt strong enough. I handled things relatively well back then, telling myself it was only temporary, which is why I stopped using it immediately after I graduated. But this time was different. I wasn't a stressed student looking for a quick boost. I was a miserable man who'd been falling into a deep hole ever since I turned 40, and I convinced myself that going back to old habits might give me the relief that I was so desperately looking for. As the nights dragged on, I found myself spending hours online, and it wasn't long before my desperation led me to the darker side of the internet. That's when I first came across Dread. I'd heard of the platform before, often described as the darknet's front page, or Reddit's dark twin on tour. I initially planned to silently observe, limiting myself to reading through anonymous posts, but after a couple of hours, I worked up the courage to post something of my own. I made sure to keep it vague, careful not to say too much. Even so, I knew that anyone paying attention would understand what I was really asking for and then point me in the right direction. A few days passed, and nothing happened. However, right when I was about to give up, I received a private DM from an anonymous person with the username White Noise. His message was short and vague, just like my post. It read, "Read your post, and it sounds like you need a helping hand on your journey. I could offer that hand the next time I choose to exist, if you still want to be enlightened." White Noise never explicitly stated what it was that he did or how he would offer a helping hand, as he intentionally kept the language vague for deniability. However, I was able to read between the lines, and I understood perfectly what was being implied, so I responded with, "I'll take the hand, if it points me in the right direction on my journey to enlightenment." And that's how my relationship with White Noise began. I had to jump through several hoops and even more cryptic messages to prove that I wasn't an undercover cop, but I was finally able to acquire the services that White Noise provided after all of his initial doubts had been cleared. One of the first things that White Noise made clear was that even though we'd met on Dread, that platform was simply a discussion forum, not a marketplace. Again, he never explicitly stated this, but he made sure we never did any business on the platform itself, only using it to vaguely communicate. I could also tell that the Anon behind White Noise was a professional due to his insane digital OPSEC, which is operational security. White Noise was obsessed with that at the highest level, constantly taking several steps that made it seem like he never even existed, in addition to keeping all of his operations untraceable. One of these many steps was the use of different usernames and accounts whenever we communicated on Dread. When I initially met him as White Noise, his username constantly changed with every new message, because I would often receive messages from other accounts with different names like Null or Static. It was hard to keep up with this. I often couldn't tell which of these accounts was actually him. So I asked if he could give me a code name that I could use if I was ever in doubt. Now, while White Noise was completely against the use of a common code name, as he liked to avoid patterns, he understood my concerns. So he told me that if I was ever unsure, or if I couldn't tell which of the many Dread accounts was truly him, I should use the name of any notable figures from the Roman Empire, like Caesar, Augustus, or Nero, and he would respond with Salve or Av. Keeping up with the hundreds of aliases was just the tip of the iceberg, because White Noise always used burner sites or single-use landing pages for all of our transactions. The technical term to describe these burner onion websites is ephemeral hidden services, and they're basically short-lived .onion sites that exist briefly for communication or for a single transaction before they're taken offline forever. I had initially thought White Noise would have a website similar to the infamous Silk Road, or Hansa, or Alpha Bay, or Dream Market, where I could choose the substances that I wanted. However, he told me that major sites draw too much attention, so he would send me a burner site where I would quickly write out the drugs that I wanted. And after he'd seen my request, the site was discarded immediately. White Noise also asked for all the payments to be made in his preferred cryptocurrency, Monero. And when I asked why he didn't just use Bitcoin, White Noise told me that Monero was a privacy-focused cryptocurrency that was virtually untraceable if no mistakes were made during the transfer. Once the payments were made, I would be sent a time and a random location where my package would be dropped. The operation was essentially ironclad, leaving no room for errors, and while the process could sometimes get complicated, it still saved me the hassle of dealing with shady street dealers at my age. I can still remember telling myself to only use a little bit every time that I picked up a package. I would often save the drugs for the hardest days and use them to give myself a little boost while I searched for new jobs. However, it wasn't long before I began using more than I was supposed to, as I found myself using after every fight with Laura and my son, Simon. This period of my life was a blur, and the only time I truly felt anything was when I was using or talking to White Noise on Dread about the next order. I even started to look forward to going out and picking up the packages, basically because it just allowed me to leave the house. I know this is going to sound crazy, but I found more comfort in my short conversations with a faceless Anon on the dark web than with my own family. And at some point, I even started thinking that White Noise was my only friend. I spent most of my days on Dread, waiting to see his next cryptic message. It began to feel like a real-life game, and the drugs were my reward. The fights with my wife became even more frequent during this period, and I started using every single day. I eventually started placing more orders than I could afford with White Noise, and I eventually racked up a large debt. I'd been secretly using the family's savings to buy the drugs, and basically it was all gone, which led me to ask for delayed payments. White Noise was initially fine with sending me packages on credit due to the frequency of my orders, but over time he got fed up with my delays and stopped sending new packages until I cleared my debt. I'd already gotten hooked at this point, and I exchanged some heated messages with White Noise because I couldn't handle this constant refusal to send me any more packages on credit. I began selling things off, like my wife's jewelry and a few other valuables in the house, to pay him back. But I knew that wouldn't cover half of the amount of my outstanding debt. So I began avoiding his constant messages, asking for the large sums of money that I owed him, and I began looking for other sellers on Dread that offered the same services, using the money that I got from selling a few valuables from the house to get my fix. I really thought I would blow over, and that White Noise would forget about the debt in due time. However, it wasn't long before he came to collect what was owed. It all began one Saturday morning when our German shepherd, Jake, went missing. My son Simon told me he wasn't in the kennel out back where he'd left him, so we all went out to look for him. We assumed he was somewhere in the neighborhood. However, after hours of searching, we weren't able to find Jake, and after coming back home, my wife told me that there was a package for me at the door with a note. I hadn't ordered anything, so I was confused as to what could be in the large brown box. However, when I opened the note, my heart dropped, and the message read, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar." Words can't explain the terror that I felt as I wondered how he'd gotten my address to send the package. I'd always been so careful whenever I picked up the packages, making sure that I was never followed, but I guess he might have followed me back home when I initially started asking for drugs on credit. I let out a muffled scream after I slowly opened the box to see, well, we know where Jake was now. I didn't let my son see it, because I didn't want him to be traumatized. And I also hid the box from my wife, because I wouldn't know where to even begin to explain the contents. I cried myself to sleep that night as I wondered what white noise had done to Jake. I remember telling myself that it couldn't get any worse than this, but unfortunately, for me, things took a much more sinister turn during the following weeks. I was still reeling from the first package when white noise sent a second box. It appeared on my doorstep roughly 2 weeks after the first one, and I quickly took the new package to my room before my family could see it. And when I opened it, I let out a guttural scream. Lying in the box was what appeared to be a human heart. I found it hard to breathe because the sight simply terrified me. But upon closer inspection, I realized that it was actually a pig's heart, and the note that was placed on top of the package read, "In the box lies the heart of the traitor Brutus, who stabbed Caesar in the back. But just like Brutus, all traitors end up falling on their own sword in the end." The cryptic, Roman-inspired note was written in red ink, and I could tell they were all referencing codename Caesar, which was often used by white noise in our earlier messages. I waited until everyone had gone to bed before burning the box with the pig heart. However, the next package arrived shortly after, and it was the worst of the three. I'd been wondering what white noise would send next, and I'd imagined it would be another morbid animal organ or some gruesome severed limb. However, what arrived was an unmarked envelope with no note. After I opened it up, I saw recent images of Laura and Simon, showing Laura picking up Simon after school. As I said earlier, there was no cryptic Roman-inspired note this time, as the close-up photos alone sent a clear message of what would come next if I didn't pay my debt. I knew that I couldn't go to the police with this. I had already implicated myself by buying illegal substances on the dark web. I also didn't have enough money to hire a private investigator who could help me track down white noise without any involvement from the authorities. I was running out of options, and I knew it was only a matter of time before white noise carried out his threats to Laura and Simon. Even if I'd been on bad terms with my wife and son for the past few months, they were the only things I had left in this world, and I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I was responsible for their deaths. So, I made up my mind to go to the authorities. After having one last family dinner, I got in the car that evening and I drove to the police station. I knew I would get charged for my involvement in the illegal activities on Dread and the dark web, but I knew it was also the only way to keep my family safe. The detectives at the station carefully listened to my confession as I told them everything from the very beginning. Once they'd finished taking down all of my statements, they immediately put my family and me under surveillance, and they began tracking down white noise. The detectives had planned on finding white noise before he could harm Laura or Simon. However, all of their efforts to track him down failed in the end. The detectives explained how difficult it was tracking white noise online, as the Anon avoided leaving any metadata by using separate, air-gapped devices for keys. He'd also avoided patterns in our payments due to his use of burner onions and disposable dead drops. As the investigation continued, the authorities attempted a different approach as they tried to trace the money that I'd sent to White Noise for the packages, but that also proved impossible as the crypto that we used, Monero, cannot be traced on the blockchain itself. This was why White Noise made sure all of the payments were made using this particular cryptocurrency, and he avoided any operational mistakes that the authorities could potentially use to link him to those payments. The detectives then tried analyzing the envelope with Laura and Simon's photos for any fingerprints that White Noise may have left, but they couldn't find anything. The detectives even analyzed the messages that White Noise had sent on Dread to see if he'd used any slang that could link him to a particular region, but this line of investigation also led to a dead end. I had no other options now but to pay White Noise the money I owed. Even though the detectives warned against this, as they told me doing so would technically constitute obstruction and that I could be charged, I couldn't risk retaliation from White Noise when he found out that I went to the authorities. So, I secretly took out another mortgage on the house, and I sent the funds that I owed to finally put an end to all of the morbid packages and threats. I never heard from White Noise again after that. The detectives were furious that I'd gone behind their backs to pay White Noise, but they chose not to pursue any obstruction charges at that point in the investigation because they knew I was under a lot of duress ever since the lives of my son and my wife were placed on the line. The authorities still continued their search even after I'd paid White Noise off, and they planned to trace my last payment to the Anon's location, hoping to get a silver lining from my mistake. However, no matter how hard they tried, the individual behind White Noise was never found. After the investigation failed to identify White Noise, the authorities turned their attention to me. Even though I'd come forward and cooperated with tracking down White Noise, I had also broken several laws before the threats. I was charged with possession of controlled substances, use of electronic communications to facilitate drug crimes, and conspiracy to purchase illegal drugs. To make matters worse, the prosecutors also charged me with intent to distribute because they argued that the large quantities of illegal substances that I acquired from White Noise exceeded what they deemed to be personal use. They came to this conclusion based on the volume and frequency of the packages that I received, and they believed that I should be investigated further. However, I had no prior record, and due to my cooperation, I was able to avoid trafficking charges. My defense, in addition to the detectives who handled my case, argued that most of the focus should be on unmasking White Noise. Due to my lack of a prior violent record, in addition to the evidence of coercion and threats, I was able to get off with a suspended sentence. While I had narrowly avoided prison time, I was given mandatory drug rehabilitation and probation supervision. I was also ordered to have no contact with any dark web platforms for the duration of my probation. I'd managed to survive my charges in court, but I couldn't survive the battle that waited for me at home. Laura asked for a divorce. I didn't blame her. I already knew my marriage wouldn't survive the truth. I'd placed them both in grave danger, and the betrayal of stealing from our savings and selling her jewelry and valuables was the final nail in the coffin. All of this pretty much destroyed the life that I thought I was holding together. And even if I'd done it to save their lives, Laura was still furious that I'd gone against the detective's advice by taking out another mortgage to pay White Noise. It was a long, bitter battle in court, but once it was over, Laura took our son, Simon, in addition to everything that I had left, and I didn't even fight her. I knew I deserved nothing for what I did. And things got a lot worse for me after Laura had taken everything, as the divorce proceedings and the mounting legal fees left me with significant debt that I was unable to pay. In the end, I'd lost my family, the house, my car, and I was left with nothing but the consequences of my own actions. There isn't a day that goes by where I don't regret logging on to the dark web and making that post on Dread. I know that I'm majorly responsible for everything that happened, but I will forever curse the day that I met the faceless Anon, who's probably still out there roaming the forums of Dread under the username White Noise. On the 23rd of May, 2019, one of the largest dark web drug cases involving the U.S. Department of Justice, Germany's Federal Criminal Police, the BKA, Europol, the Dutch National Police, Eurojust, the FBI, and the DEA, led to the closure of a major dark web marketplace. The operation brought an end to the infamous Wall Street Market, which is an important dark web marketplace that functioned as a central distribution point for just about anything you can imagine, all sorts of contraband and illegal substances. The case was part of a nearly 2-year internal investigation, and while it led to the arrest of the marketplace's administrators, who were identified as Thibault Lucet, Klaus Martin Frost, Jonathan Kalla, and Marcus Paulo, the authorities believed that a few major players were able to escape and continue operations on other parts of the dark web. The authorities followed several new investigative threads after the fall of Wall Street Market, leading to another operation in 2020 called Operation Disruptor, which resulted in 179 arrests. Roughly 500 kilograms of drugs were seized, in addition to millions of dollars in virtual currency and cash. However, several dark web vendor accounts once again eluded the authorities, and one of those vendors is believed to be the anonymous individual who is now operating under the username White Noise on the dark web platform Dread. The details of the story you just heard were based on a real true crime case, as several reports state that a few major players on Wall Street Market, before its collapse in 2019, had extensive ties to the forum Dread. Authorities were able to uncover evidence that proves the leakage of back-end credentials and server information on Dread to temporarily destabilize the market during their investigation. And while nothing's been confirmed, the Anon behind White Noise is said to be deeply involved in these operations. The real name of the individual in the story who came into contact with White Noise on Dread has been redacted in the case file. The names used in the story for his family were also aliases to keep their identities safe, so finding any additional information on their current whereabouts proved difficult. Further investigation showed that the dark web vendor operating under the username of White Noise was linked to markets such as White House Market, Wall Street Market, Empire, Nightmare, and several other dark web marketplaces. The elusive White Noise had apparently avoided being caught during the fall of Wall Street Market and Operation Disruptor by migrating to new markets, re-establishing vendor accounts, and strategically resetting his infrastructure. In 2019, federal prosecutors brought several indictments against other dark web distributors. However, during their best efforts, the Anon behind White Noise continues to evade authorities, carrying out his seemingly untraceable activities on the dark web. One of my favorite movie quotes is from the 1999 film Hackers, and it goes, "Remember, hacking is more than just a crime. It's a survival trait." I used to live by this quote as it pushed me to build my skills as an elite hacker. I never boxed myself in with black hat, malicious hackers or white hat ethical hackers, and I always prided myself on forging my own unique version of a hacker's ethic. However, I found myself questioning my ethics as a hacker when the skills that I had honed over the years were used to take the lives of people who were very dear to me. Like most elite hackers, my story begins on the dark web. I'd been lurking around the dark web for as long as I can remember. I was active on underground hacking forums like HackBB in the early 2010s, and later joined the exclusive Dark Code hacker forum before it was shut down in 2015. I'd also done thousands of hacking jobs in the dark web, ranging from penetration testing for criminal dark web marketplaces to DDoS mitigation consulting, escrow system audits, and infrastructure hardening for several dark web services. Hacking was my life, and I was never too far from my computer. My social life was abysmal, and I rarely spoke to anyone, with the exception of my little sister, Maggie. She was the only family that I had left, and even though we were siblings, we were polar opposites. Maggie was a very social and outgoing person, and she would always drag me away from my computer whenever she visited, before forcing me to go home with her to have dinner with her husband, Neil, and my teenage niece, Charlotte. I never had a family of my own due to the nature of my job, and I never regretted that decision. However, I enjoyed spending time with Maggie's family, particularly my niece, Charlotte, who was a very kind-hearted and compassionate girl. My sister's husband, Neil, was also a great guy, and I even looked forward to having dinner with them and catching up whenever Maggie came to visit. After having these occasional dinners with Maggie's family, I would bury myself in work, and when I wasn't working, I usually spent all of my time on the infamous dark web hacker forum called CryptBB. I would read through hundreds of threads and make some posts of my own. I often left commentary, critiques, and high-level insights on recent breaches or OPSEC practices. I usually spent hours on the forum, and on one random Saturday, I received a private message from user 404. It read, "Hey, I appreciated your comments in the thread earlier. That's some high-level stuff. I'm a young hacker in high school who's starting out on his hacking journey, and I've read through most of your posts on the forum. I'm still learning and trying to understand which fundamentals to focus on first, and your insights have helped me a lot. So, if you have any more advice, I'd really appreciate it." I'd already seen the young hacker in several threads on CryptBB, and I could tell it took a lot of courage to send me a private message. I was flattered by his appreciation, and his text reminded me of when I was just starting out. I sent him a response, telling him to focus on the basics before moving on to higher level material. I then told him that while I wasn't a mentor, I would gladly respond to any questions that he had whenever I was free. This was the beginning of my relationship with the young hacker, user 404. We would send messages back and forth whenever I wasn't working on a job or having dinner with Maggie's family. I would send him several texts covering hacking basics like attack surfaces, OPSEC, threat models, and TCP/IP. I put an emphasis on networking fundamentals, as I told him that a hacker is blind if he doesn't know how data moves or understand how traffic flows. And once he's covered the basics, we moved on to intermediate topics like enumeration, misconfiguration, access control, privilege boundaries, and credential reuse. In most of my texts, I would remind him to think like an operator and to always put enumeration before exploitation. The young hacker was a fast learner, and it wasn't long before we'd reached advanced levels covering topics like unauthorized access, lateral movement, and persistence before moving on to logs and forensic artifacts. I explained how he shouldn't always focus on being clever, as he only wins if he leaves nothing behind. And over the course of these messages, I built a strong relationship with the anonymous young hacker. He would often joke that he was my young Padawan whenever I showed him something new. Our trust grew with each passing month, and our conversations sometimes veered into personal topics. User 404 would tell me how his high school was the seventh circle of hell. He explained how he was constantly being bullied because his classmates just didn't get him. And then he told me how Crypt BB was the only place that he felt like he belonged, and how glad he was that I responded to his messages, as no one had ever responded before. I felt bad for him, and I tried to cheer him up by telling him that high school is hell for everyone, but it eventually comes to an end when you graduate. I then assured him that he'd probably have a better experience in college after he found his people, and even if that didn't work out, he could always just spend all of his time with his PC, before joking that computers are much nicer than people are. User 404 then told me that he didn't really talk about what he was going through with anybody offline, and that our messages and hacking lessons served as a good outlet for him. I was glad that I could help him vent in between lessons, and eventually, User 404 told me that even if it broke the sacred hacker's code of anonymity, he wanted me to know that his real name was Billy. I appreciated his trust, but I warned him to never reveal his real name again on the dark web, as that was the one golden rule that a hacker should never cross. Even with that said, Billy's honesty took our relationship to another level, and we began to talk much more freely. He would tell me everything from weird teachers at school to how hard life was at home with his single mom. He even told me about his girl problems, sending a lengthy text explaining how he'd asked out a really sweet girl at school only to be rejected. He said it hurt him badly, and I tried my best to console him by explaining that it happens to almost everyone, as it's a scary high school rite of passage almost. I told him to keep his chin up, and I assured him that he'd probably find someone else who shared his interests in the near future. I began to look forward to Billy's texts, and even though I wasn't being paid for it, I still enjoyed passing on my knowledge and hearing him vent from time to time. Everything remained normal for a while until one fateful Wednesday when I received a strange, cryptic message from Billy that read, "Today, justice was served." Confused, I responded, "What do you mean, Billy?" And it took a few minutes for him to respond, but Billy eventually sent a long rant about how he'd handled the people who'd been making his life a living hell in high school. I remember having an uneasy feeling in my stomach as I wondered what he meant by handled. And it was at this point that Billy went on to reveal how he'd used the things that I taught him to get into the school's records. He told me he doxed the address of all of his bullies online after illegally acquiring them from the student information system. He then anonymously called in SWAT raids on all of their homes to teach them a lesson. I was horrified by Billy's confession, but that wasn't even the worst of it. Billy went on to explain how he'd compromised the account of a girl who had rejected him to get his revenge. He'd easily gained unauthorized access to private data in the cloud, which he used to release sensitive images to everyone at school, as he planned to embarrass her. He even went on to proudly state how he'd also called in another SWAT raid at her address to make her life even more miserable. I had no words. The messages that Billy sent made me want to throw up. I knew I had no moral high ground to reprimand him, I never deemed myself an ethical hacker. However, I drew the line when minors were involved, and it sickened me that Billy had used the things that I taught him to torment and traumatize a young girl for rejecting him. His repeated swatting also alarmed me, as I knew how dangerous it was. And for those that don't know what swatting is, it's the action or practice of making a prank call to emergency services in an attempt to bring about the dispatch of a large number of armed police officers to somebody's address. It's very stressful, it's very traumatizing, and it's a bit of a bummer. I immediately told him that no one deserved to have their home illegally raided, even if they were bullies. I told him it was illegal to access and share private photos of his classmates, and I reminded him that convicted swatters could face years in prison. Billy wasn't happy that I was displeased, and he sent a message that read, "I thought you, of all people, would understand." I was completely infuriated at this point, and I told him that his actions disgusted me and that I never wanted to talk to him again. Billy's account went dark for a little while after my last message. I didn't hear from him again. The regret that I felt for giving him the skills that he used to torment his classmates began to eat me up inside, and I hope that none of the kids or their families were hurt. However, while I didn't know it at the time, I would later receive a morbid phone call that reflected just how grave the consequences of my actions were. My phone rang at 6:18 that evening, and I picked it up to hear my little sister Maggie wailing on the other end. Through sobs, she explained how a kid at school had leaked private, sensitive images of my niece, Charlotte, everywhere, which led her to take her own life. The news got worse from there, as she also revealed that Neil had been shot dead when someone called in a false SWAT raid on their home. Maggie had been picking up groceries when it all happened, and she came back to find a SWAT team surrounding their house. I threw up everything that I'd had for lunch as the horrific realization dawned on me. The news of the incident followed shortly after, and I couldn't believe that the sweet girl that Billy had described was my niece Charlotte. The authorities said that they managed to identify the perpetrator. It was a boy named Billy Coleman. However, he'd fled from home after being discovered, and the authorities were still searching for him. I could never look my sister in the eyes, even after we buried Charlotte and Neil. The guilt that I felt destroyed me inside, as I knew I'd given the skills to the person who killed my niece and my sister's husband. Maggie was never the same after their deaths. She lost the light in her eyes and remained a hollow shell in the years that followed. I didn't touch my computer for months after the incident, and even when I did, I couldn't bring myself to hack anything ever again. The hacking that used to bring me so much joy now served as a constant reminder of my niece's death, and I felt disgusted whenever I sat in front of a computer. I stopped taking jobs as I veered farther away from the world of hacking, and I used the money I'd saved up to take care of my little sister. I thought about, telling her the truth, but I knew it would only break her even more, and that it would destroy the image of the only person that she had left. So I carried the burden of guilt alone, and I dedicated my days to trying to heal the hole in her heart. It's been years since the horrific incident happened, but my guilt has only grown with every day that passes. Billy's actions left me with a lifelong lesson, and that's how important it is to define your ethics as a hacker. You never fully understand how dangerous the skills you possess can be until you see firsthand how the same skills you once prided yourself on are used to harm the people that you love. Several records show that there's been an alarming increase in documented cases of young girls taking their lives after intimate images were shared or circulated among peers without their consent. And the story you just heard was written based on one of those exact cases. The details of the individuals involved in the actual case were redacted to protect their privacy. However, the anonymous story detailing the event is believed to have been released by the victim's uncle, who later confessed to his indirect involvement in the case. Several reports corroborate the details of the story, as there was another swatting incident related to the case that ended in the death of a 47-year-old man whose name was never publicly released. The victim's wife, whose name was also not released, wasn't present during the raid, and her current whereabouts remain unknown. The identity of the young hacker responsible was also redacted, as the name used in the story is an alias. This tragic case sheds light on the extreme dangers of swatting. In January 2025, the U.S. Congress introduced the Preserving Safe Communities by Ending Swatting Act to strictly penalize these hoaxes, with penalties of up to 20 years in prison if someone is seriously hurt during a raid. The horrific actions of the young hacker, who maliciously used the victim's information, have also led to a strong push for ethical hacking programs that allow young hackers to channel their skills ethically through cybersecurity education and bug bounty programs. Several initiatives focusing on structured pathways, such as Cyber First, in addition to positive outlets like CEH certifications, have emerged over the years. These initiatives guide talent away from illegal activities and toward ethical, or white hat, hacking. However, despite these efforts, many young hackers still prefer unethical or black hat hacking. These individuals choose to use their skills maliciously, with the majority honing their abilities on dark web marketplaces and services to this very day.